This video will walk through the process for planning your farm and ranch asset protection using the Farm Flood Readiness Toolkit. This is one of two videos that accompany the toolkit. As the climate changes, BC is seeing more frequent rainfall, more intense rainfall events, and more rapid snowmelt. This means more and more farms are at risk of flooding. That's why we've designed the Farm Flood Readiness Toolkit, to help producers like you take action to prepare for flooding and to recover more quickly when it happens. Preparing for extreme weather events like floods can feel overwhelming, but you can take action to protect your farm buildings, equipment, and infrastructure from flooding. This video will walk you through 3 basic steps to get started. How to assess risk. The level of risk is determined by how severe a hazard is and how vulnerable an asset is. The first part of determining risk is assessing your farm's flood hazard. You may already know a lot about your farm's flood hazard. A key thing to remember is that this hazard might be changing with climate change. To learn more about the flood hazard at your location, contact your local government planning department or check their website for information about flood maps. Find historical floodplain maps by region through the Province of BC website. Refer to the Climate Change Adaptation Program Farm Flood Readiness Toolkit Regional Snapshots at bcclimatechangeadaptation.ca. A self-assessment can also be helpful for determining your farm's flood hazard. Ask yourself, how close is my farm to water bodies? How close is my farm to any dikes? Have I noticed any stormwater ponding on my land or overland flow? How close am I to upland areas that may create runoff? In certain parts of BC, you will need to consider how close your farm is to the Pacific coast and whether your farm is vulnerable to sea level rise, storm surge, and/or large tides. Is my farm located in an area with a high water table? The more you answer yes to these questions, the greater your flood hazard. The second step is to assess your farm assets. Start by making a list of all your assets. The toolkit lists assets to consider. Listing your farm assets and evaluating their vulnerability will help you to think through the impacts of flooding and link this to actions you can take to reduce damages. In addition to an asset list, it can also be helpful to create a base map of your farm. A base map summarizes key information about your operation. For example, it can show the locations of livestock, equipment, and hazardous materials. A map may also help you to visualize where your operation is most vulnerable to flood or which areas you most wish to protect. Having a map means you can also quickly share this critical information with others, such as emergency responders. This final step will help you to determine the level of risk for each farm asset and then identify actions to protect assets at high risk. This table from Fact Sheet 2 in the toolkit provides an example of how to combine information about your flood hazard and your assets to define the level of risk and therefore level of action required. For example, if you have an asset in a location with a high likelihood of flooding impact and that asset is also a high priority asset for you, meaning it's either expensive or essential to farm operation or affects animal life and health, then your risk level is extreme and you will want to prioritize taking action to protect it. Worksheet D enables you to prioritize your assets and plan for their protection. First, list your assets. Then, think through how vulnerable these assets are to flooding and what the repercussions would be if an asset was flooded. For example, would your asset withstand a relatively shallow flood? Would it be lost if it's underwater even for a short time? And so forth. Feel free to pause the video here to read through a few potential examples that have been illustrated. Then, based upon the details you have jotted down with respect to the asset vulnerability, you can assign a ranking to the asset. How high of a priority is it to protect each asset? For any assets that you have ranked high, you can use the last column to jot down what actions you could take to protect this asset. The toolkit contains detailed fact sheets covering both temporary and permanent flood protection measures. Some actions will be more difficult and more costly than others, but for those assets that are ranked high, it is important to identify and consider solutions. For example, if your entire feed supply is vulnerable to flooding, even at low flood levels, then taking action is a priority. An example of a low-cost option for temporary protection would be to have materials ready for installing a temporary flood barrier. This can be done using a polywrap berm around the feed storage area, which is a fairly low-cost option. Alternatively, Store or plan to relocate some of their feed at another location that is less likely to flood. A more permanent and costly solution, which you would need to do well in advance, would be to elevate your feed storage above potential flooding levels. For more information and to see the other sections of the toolkit in detail, download the toolkit by visiting bcclimatechangeadaptation.ca. To get started with protecting your assets, begin by walking your farm to ground truth what you've been thinking about with respect to potential flood hazards. You might find it helpful to do this with a family member, business partner, or employee to discuss issues as you go. Then print a copy of the toolkit or use the form fillable PDF to begin populating the worksheets. You can also watch our video, Prepare for Flooding. It explains why it's important to prepare for flooding and use the toolkit. For help with your flood preparedness plan, please contact your regional agrologist or your local government emergency manager.